Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Misinformation Podcast. I am Z, aka the Reluctant Accountant. Oh my gosh, it's Black History Month, so I've got a very special episode for you today. Let's get into it. So the subject of today's episode is going to be based on actually a video that I did. So I did this small video, very short video, and I put it out on social media, and it was very, very popular. All the blogs picked it up. They didn't tag me. Thanks for that. Anyway, they didn't tag me, but it was a very popular video, and it was based on this report that I'd read, because sometimes in my downtime, I like to read economic reports. Why not? And so I read this report, and it basically said that Africa actually doesn't owe the world this huge debt. The world owes Africa. And that's something that a lot of people say anyway, you know, like we're like, oh, Africa's so rich and it's got so many resources and yada, yada, yada. And actually you guys are just pilfering and whatever. But this was the first time that I'd seen it expressed in like real economic terms. And so I thought I was going to dig a little bit into that with you. Stay with me. We'll get through it. It's going to be hopefully very easy to follow. But I just thought I'd elaborate a little bit more on that video because as I said, the video was very popular. I look kind of cute in it. So go check it out. But yes, I felt like it's very, very important for me to kind of back up what I've said in terms of like where I've got the information from and how these people are like really thinking about these things. And I think also it was a very good subject matter that helped really contextualize the role of the West, if you like, in Africa and the West and more so nowadays, it's not just the West, is it? You've got like China and you've got other, Russia that have got other interests also in the African continent. But yes, this is the title. This is what we're going to look at today. Is Africa the net creditor of the world? So I want some of you to listen up because I feel like a lot of times, and this is, please don't hate me. I mean, you can if you want. It's up to you. You've got free will. Do what you want. Hate me if you must. But I feel like sometimes people talk about certain things and there's no follow through, right? So they'll be like, actually, Africa's just really rich. We've got all these like cobalt, or we've got this, or we've got that. And I think when people can be questioned, and not all the time, but sometimes when there's a question that's placed on that, because sometimes we read headlines about things. So we'll hear, for example, me saying, oh, Africa's the world's net creditor. You may go and reference that and people will be like, what do you mean? And you're like, I mean that Africa, you guys owe Africa money. Okay, but what does that mean? It means that you guys owe Africa money, that kind of thing. And that's why I want to kind of give us a little bit of substance. Like when we're going out and being like, not just contrarian, but like making these statements that aren't the ones that are the prominent statements. They're not the things that people put out when they're putting out their big economic forum reports and they're talking about how much debt that, African nations owe the IMF this, or they owe the World Bank that, and whatever. We don't hear about this net creditor situation. So with that in mind, like how does this come about? What am I talking about? Well, let me get into it for you. So the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development says Africa has acted as a net creditor to the rest of the world for the past 30 years. So this ain't no short-term thing. This is a long-term thing. This is a long-term debt they got. So that's a whole mortgage, okay? And they still haven't paid it off. So there's been a cumulative outflow of about 1.5 trillion. Some estimates put it at 2 trillion from the continent over that period. That is a whole heap of money. Wow. This is what I'm saying. So for the past 30 years, what they're basically saying is that Africa has actually acted as the world's net creditor. And so again, let's get into it. What does that even mean? Well, before I get into it and explain it, I think that when I'm doing so, I would like us to work on suspending some of the kind of imperialist, supremacist ideals that we have, those kind of, what I'm talking about. We may harbor them, and we all do to a certain extent. Most of us will. And it can be hard to admit it. But you know what? Sometimes we just need to hold our hands up and admit that we were singing along to very questionable lyrics like, just thank God it's them instead of you, when we were singing, do they know it's Christmas time for Band-Aid? And that was how we saw Africa, right? That's how we saw African nations. This is the message that we were getting through. And I feel like there was a sense of superiority. We were going to save them. We were going to save Africa. I mean, that line is really outrageous. Just thank God it's them instead of you. Still there, still just floating around within that song. So go and listen to it. Actually, don't. But yes, if you grew up without a direct relationship with Africa or the African nations, there's a good chance that your perspective was shaped by what you consumed in the media and basically what people told you. And for the most part, that wasn't a positive thing that we heard. There wasn't lots of positive information that was flowing out of the African continent and flowing certainly towards the UK. If you want some examples, we have apartheid in South Africa. We had the genocide in Rwanda. We had the famine in Ethiopia. These were the predominant stories that came out. These were the things that we looked and we were like, you know what, that place is just a mess. They've got so many things going on. And so we'd send aid and we'd pat ourselves on the back and just be like, you know what, we've done all we can here. But we can't help them. We can't help the poor Africans. We can't help them any more than that. And we'll just send them this aid and the greatest gift they'll have this year will be life. Yeah, that was another lyric. Anyway, but I digress. So that's what happened. And I kind of feel like, if we're being honest, we dined out on this kind of misinformation. Not to say that those events didn't happen. Obviously, there was apartheid in South Africa, there was a famine, and there was genocide in Rwanda. But that also shaped our perspective to a certain extent on the average experience of the average African person or the average African nation. And also, when we heard these stories of these events, these huge, tremendous, life-changing events that were occurring, the role, if there was a role that was played by Western actors, that certainly wasn't highlighted. That was just a problem that belonged to the continent. That was, maybe their mismanagement or their, apartheid is always very much viewed as like this thing that happened in South Africa. But if you dig deeper, roads kind of lead back to Europe a lot of the time. So when we're thinking about these things, and this is the reason I kind of preface what I'm going to say with these, points and these explanations, is not because I'm just going to sit here bashing the West or whatever. I mean, I could do that because, that's what we could do in this country. We could bash whoever we want to. I could do that. But what I'm saying is I want us to kind of at least exist in the space that we acknowledge that we may have a little bit of skepticism that has been embedded in us inherently because of the perceptions that we've had growing up, or the perceptions that we've had that have been shaped even in a slight way by the media that we've consumed, by the images that we've seen, and by the stories that we've heard, that may not reflect the whole truth, that may lack a lot of context, and sometimes just may be false. But that's what we have. And so if I'm going into this and I'm going to kind of tell you these things, I want you to kind of have that hat on. Have the hat on that says, actually, I haven't always known the whole truth about this continent. I haven't always been given the whole truth about this continent. Okay, I'm going to stop rambling. I'm going to get into it now because I know you're getting fed up, and that's okay. It's okay to be fed up sometimes. You know what? Sit in that. Breathe in and breathe out. Let's go. Okay, let's unpack the claim that I've made, okay? So, before I get into it, I need to explain a few words, or the definition of a few words. And I did this in the kind of short video, and I'm going to do this now. It's not going to take a long time, but there are three phrases in particular that it's quite important that you understand what they mean. So the first one is capital flight. So capital flight is basically when assets or like cash or money rapidly flow out of a country. Now, normally this is as the result of some like event. So, for example, there could be like a huge devaluation of currency, or there could be like some economic other destabilizing events, such like a war, a civil war, or a change in government that's kind of viewed as negative. And what it means is that a lot of assets, a lot of money is taken out of a country. So that is the way that capital flight is often defined. If you go and look it up, that's the kind of definition that you'll see. It will talk about assets or money kind of being moved out of a country at a large scale, and it's the result of some kind of, political event or natural disaster or whatever it is. So that's the first one. And we'll kind of come back to capital flight. The other one that I want you to know is foreign direct investment. It's often written as FDI, but it's foreign direct investment. So that's a cross-border investment. It's where a company or an individual from one country invest in a business or corporation or something in another country. And they do that for many reasons, like because they want money, but it's also they can gain some sort of like lasting interest and influence over operations. And also that can be done to also have political influence in many ways. And again, I'll get back to that. And the final phrase that I want you to remember is illicit financial flows. Illicit financial flows. So that is the movement of money or assets across a border, which is illegal in source, transfer, or use. So the reason that I was saying I'd come back to capital flight is because these illicit financial flows are a form of capital flight. It's just that they're illegal. So normally when people talk about capital flight, they're doing it under the guise of, oh, well, this is a legal movement of assets and money and so on and so forth. Whereas illicit financial flows specifically is saying that when this is kind of ill-gotten gains or whatever, and you're not supposed to be moving the money in that way. Now, the problem is that these things can be rampant in African nations. And it's a way of keeping these countries in a perpetual state of underdevelopment. And why I say underdevelopment is because we're very much aware that they're not necessarily developed in the same way that kind of Western countries are. And that's often looked at as though they just have this inability to develop. They just, they can't do it. They don't know what they're doing. But I want you to consider the following. There were only 2 countries in Africa that weren't really colonized, and that was Ethiopia and Liberia. And South Sudan, which was the last independent country to be recognized on a worldwide scale in Africa, was only gained that independence in 2011. In 2011. Basically, South Sudan is like Gen Z in terms of maturity of a country. They were just born the other day. And so the backdrop of this, you've got these African nations that just gained their independence very recently, within the last, 60, 70 years, most of them. And that means that there are people living and existing today that lived under colonization. They lived under this foreign rule. So up until very recently, that also means that these ex-colonial powers were able to extract as much wealth and money and do whatever they wanted with these countries with little repercussions and little thought or little authority to kind of, enforce any reinvestment into those economies that they were taking money out of. They could just do whatever they wanted to. And so we kind of look at this and they were like, oh, well, they're independent now. Everything should be rosy. But are we really thinking, knowing what we know, that everybody knows that Africa is this continent with the most natural resources and, enough natural resources to kind of rule the world, if you like, do we really think that these people were just going to leave and go, oh, thank you, good luck, that was great, we hope you do the best? Do you think they were just going to give up that stream of income, that stream of wealth, that stream just like that? The answer is no. Because the first thing you can do is look at, for example, the path of foreign direct investment. And that very much mirrors the pathway of these ex-colonial powers, okay? The way that they're, apparently investing, but it's very much a way to extract wealth, extract resources from these nations and do it under this guise of legitimacy now. And it's always dressed up as under this guise of we're going to do something to help these kind of immature African nations. We're going to go in there and we're going to set up this corporation, but you know what? The corporation is going to bring jobs, or it's going to bring this, or it's going to bring that. And oftentimes what you'll find is that they are able to do certain things in these regions because they can take advantage of the immature regulation, for example, or the immature regulatory environment in which they're operating. And so there are practices that take place in those countries that wouldn't be allowed in their own countries, but they do it anyway because it's Africa, TIA. And so countries do need investment. I'm not saying that they don't. They do need investment. But even when governments seek to build infrastructure and do those things and perhaps try to help their populations, they are often serviced by foreign-owned companies, and that can be very expensive, and oftentimes the service isn't necessarily up to standard or the standard that would be required, and that can be a heavy drain on government and government resources. And that is a problem even in this country. When the government tried to do their private finance initiative and when they were trying to secure or give contracts out with these private entities, when you do that with a for-profit making entity, they are going to want to make profit. They're not necessarily going to give a damn about the workers and the people that are there and even the quality of the output that they have, because they've got the contract and they've secured it. And there's also an inflationary costing that they give to people. So they'll bump up the price of this, that, and the other. Whereas if the government had done this through their own without giving these contracts away, many studies have shown that they would have been many, many times less expensive than doing it with these private sectors. And so this is the issue that you have when you look at these African nations. You've got people that are essentially ready just to take advantage. They're really ready to go there and take advantage of the governments and the positions they're in. And that's not to say there aren't, bad actors in the governments over there, but it isn't helped by the fact that essentially people are just baying over African nations and waiting to see whatever they can do. And this foreign direct investment is one of the ways that can happen. So from 1970 to 2018, it was thought that African nations lost, as I said, up to 2 trillion in capital flight, which is almost the annual gross domestic product of all of the sub-Saharan African countries combined, by the way. So there's up to 2 trillion in capital flight, and compare that with around 47 billion in aid inflowing into the country. And that's where you can see the deficit there, and that being Africa is a net creditor to the world. And the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development disclosed that $88.6 billion goes up in smoke from the continent every single year. Okay, but let me not do that thing, right? Let me not do that thing where I'm Africa. Africa is one country. So, because we know it isn't. But I'm going to Africa. Why are you from Africa? No, I'm not going to do that. So what I'm going to do is, let's break it down. Let's look at a few actual countries and look at the stats coming from there and see what the impact of this stuff is. So you've got Angola. Angola is a country that's really rich in oil, and they lost over 100 billion in capital flight from 1986 to 2018. This was due to the mismanagement of oil resources through collusion between the political elites, multinational companies, that's very important, and international banks. 100 billion. South Africa, a country rich in several minerals, lost 329 billion from 1970 to 2018. That was due to misinvoicing of mineral exports, embezzlement of state resources by state-owned companies, and collusion of politicians and private actors. And so again, this misinvoicing is one of the key ways that you can experience capital flight or these illicit financial flows. And so what does that mean? I just want to give some context, because when people think what does misinvoicing even mean? So if you think about it, when you are, what you pay tax on in any country, for example, is the profit. No, people don't pay tax on revenue. So say you have a company and you make loads and loads of sales, a way to reduce your profit is to increase your costs. And the way that you can increase your cost is by creating invoices or declaring expenses that didn't really occur. So if you do that, then you can reduce the amount of profit that you're declaring and ultimately reduce the amount of tax you pay on that. And so that's one of the things. Misinvoicing, you can do that that's a way of avoiding taxation. I'm saying avoiding, is evading, and it's illegal, so don't do it. This isn't advice to go and do that, by the way. Okay, so and finally, in Côte d'Ivoire, in the Ivory Coast, that cocoa sector there has enriched the political elite and multinational companies through exports at the expense of the Ivorian farmers. And there are many more examples. There are many more examples of this, and many more examples of the general everyday citizens in these African nations being taken advantage of, while the political elites collude with, corrupt officials from abroad and corrupt, bad actors in multinational organizations with a for-profit motive that really haven't thought about the impact on the everyday, on the little guy, essentially. So there is a very, very big need to address the problem of capital flight or illicit financial flows, which I'm using interchangeably a little bit here in Africa. And this need and these stories are detailed in a book called On the Trail of Capital Flight from Africa, The Takers and the Enablers by Leonce Dikumana. I hope that I said that name correctly. But yeah, it's a very, very good book. So go and have a read of that. And you can, if you want to learn more about this subject matter, he has much more case studies, and he's an economist, and I think he now works in a university in Boston, but I may have got that wrong. Definitely one in the US, by the way. So go and have a look at that book. And so I bring this up because I think it's always important to keep these things in mind when you're discussing economics in Africa and economics on the African continent, because I think it's a part of the discourse that's often left out. For example, one of the big things that I've noticed is when they're releasing those corruption indices of the countries, so they'll like have a list of all the most corrupt countries in the world, you'll very, very, very rarely see like these westernized nations featuring anywhere near the top, which I find very suspicious, because I don't think it's the case that those places aren't corrupt. Indeed, if you speak to the average like UK citizen or the US citizen or wherever, they will say to you, oh yeah, the government is highly corrupt. And I think all that's happened, especially after the so-called end of colonialization, is that they've managed to put in place a framework in which certain types of corruption are not viewed as corruption. They're just viewed as legitimate business practices. And other types, more explicit types, those are the ones that we point at and go, oh my God, those people are really corrupt. So it's not that we're not corrupt as a nation. It's not that we don't have corrupt practices. I think it's just that they've gotten better at hiding it. Essentially, that's what's happened. But let me know what you think. Am I being too harsh? Possibly. I don't know. But that is all I've got time for today's episode. I want to thank you again for joining me. It is Black History Month, so I'm going to try to make sure that the episodes are kind of a little bit about Black history, something a little bit different. If you've enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to subscribe and write comments below and tell everybody how great you thought it was. And if you've enjoyed it, tell your friends. And if you haven't, tell 8. Because you know what? Bad news spreads faster than good. Whatever, no one cares. The algorithm certainly doesn't. Can't tell the difference. So please feel free to kind of interact with this wherever you see it. If you would like to get in touch with me, tell me how great you found the episode. Or not, whatever. You can catch me at The Misinformation Podcast. That's Miss with 2 S's. The Misinformation Podcast at gmail.com. I'm also on social medias, babes. I'm on TikTok at The Reluctant Accountant. That's TikTok at The Reluctant Accountant. And I say I'm on TikTok. When they ban me, I will obviously not be there because they are trying to. And I'm also on Instagram. They're a little bit lax, so maybe find me there. I'm on Instagram at The Reluctant Accountant. But until next week, thank you for joining me, and I'll see you later. Ciao.